change my name. Really good.
Hello, Christopher and Ray. I haven't seen you for a very long time.
How are you?
Well, hot at the moment. I've just been mowing a lawn. And I thought I'd try and get it done as soon as possible before the sun burned me up completely. And how are you two?
Yeah, I'm all right.
Good.
Yeah.
I am well.
Yes.
Wandering along these days, with COVID slowly getting less and less. One is able to go out and do things, which is very nice.
That's right. Yes.
But how have you coped with this straitened times?
Well, in some ways, okay, because I've got involved in quite a lot of these Zooms, which has been very interesting, going far and wide. But at the same time, I tend to be a real sort of wanderer, going places here and there. So I feel very restricted at the same time.
Oh, definitely.
So a bit of a mixture.
Yeah. I'm extremely lucky in the fact of 5 minutes away from where I now live. There's Durham Down.
Oh, so, lovely.
So walking down there has always been rather pleasant.
Yes, good.
Morning, Angela.
Good morning, Ray.
How are you?
I'm okay. I had my family come to visit me for the first time since September. We were all double jabbed, with one exception, my 13-year-old granddaughter. She went back to school last Monday, and someone in the school in her class had proved positive, so the whole class had to be tested, and she was positive. So I'm in my house, in my garden, for 10 days. But
jolly.
we had a lovely time.
Yes, I remember your lad Jesse. He must be quite old now.
Not my lad.
No, wrong Angela.
Wrong Angela.
I've got 2 daughters, 4 grandchildren, 1 grandson and 3 granddaughters.
My apologies. I was confusing.
Don't worry.
Confusing you with Angela Vitalinginum.
Yeah, no, I'm Angela Orset.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, of course you know.
Humble apologies.
No apologies needed. None needed.
Morning, Graham. Okay, right over there. Well, it's a lovely day outside.
It's beautiful. Beautiful.
Yes, sir. I've got all my curtains pulled to keep it out of my flat. So. It's
today. It's someone called Horfield Meeting for worship.
Let me change.
Morning, Grace. I have to go on to mute quite a lot at the moment because in this block of flats where I'm living at the moment, they're fitting in a new fire alarm system, and the drilling in some of the walls, is exceedingly loud. So I get very which isn't good, at all, as he says in his mock Irish. But it's most annoying. They're going to be here until the end of the month, until August now, because they're behind. They're behind in their timings. Growl and grouse and things like that. There you go. And that's it. It's an enormous quiet time, and I'm the inveterate joke teller. I heard one a few days ago, which I thought was quite funny, so I will relate it to you now. A little Jewish guy is dying on the street, and no one knows he's Jewish, so they get a vicar to come to him. Sorry, Graham? Can't hear you, mate.
Yeah.
Still can't hear you.
I don't think he can hear us either.
No, no.
Here's the chat.
Is there something called chat that you could write a note to him?
Yeah,
with?
I'm going to.
Is he plugged into his own machine?
So,
Have you sent something?
yeah.
Did you send it to him personally? Because I haven't.
Yes.
Oh, jolly good. It's like one of those silent films, isn't it?
Yeah. But in colour, which they weren't. So.
Well, quite. Yes.
Yeah.
Might be Graham's headphones. That's the problem.
Yeah, could be.
I'm not sure he's seen the chat, but
Yeah. Difficult, isn't it?
You want to send it as a kind of a all?
Yeah, let's do that.
oh, idiot. Sorry, I'll learn how to do this one day.
I shall send an all one.
Yeah.
Oh, you're going to do that, right? I'll try. Don't very much about.
Sent it. It'd be a bit awkward if we can't hear him because he's supposed to be speaking today.
Yeah.
Let's get his phone number.
Yeah. Try phoning. or asking him if he could take his headphones off, because someone suggested that might be the problem.
So I think he has problems with hearing at the moment. So.
Oh, it's difficult. It's difficult.
I put up a sign saying, "We can't hear you."
Yeah, that's what you ought to do. Yeah, we can't hear you. Because you can see. Why don't you? Have you got a bit of paper to do that?
Yeah. Yeah. Because I guess everybody else got my one. Says we cannot hear you, Graham.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Graham realised there's a problem, but not sure he knows what to do about it.
Yeah.
That any good? Don't know whether that works.
No, it hasn't indicated anything today.
No, no.
Morning, good morning, David.
Hi, Ray. I've got a.
Valerie, it's
I'm showing up in the middle of technical issues.
We're having problems because we can't hear Graham at the moment, and seeing as he's the man who's going to be speaking.
Yeah, that makes it more difficult. Has Graham tried signing out and signing back in again?
well, we're just trying to speak to him. So, hi, Graham. It's Christopher Denman here. We can't hear you, and I assume you can't hear us. Is that right? Oh. Right. 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 If you can hear us, David Saunders is the person who's most likely to be able to help technically. So when he's finished his breakfast, if you can hear him, we'll get him to talk to you. But it may be that you just need to restart your computer, because I've had problems like that in the past, and then you restart it and it just goes. But anyway,
I'm only any good with Macintoshes, so.
Oh, right.
If it's a PC, I would just say, disconnect, reconnect, restart, try all the usual things. If it worked yesterday, it should work today.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Oh. Sounded as though. Say something, Graham.
Graham, can you hear us? Can you try saying something?
You probably heard that through my phone.
We heard something coming up through your phone, but not much.
Anyway, leave him to. No. Will somebody please think of something to do for 5 minutes, or we'll have Ray telling us more jokes and we.
We haven't heard the first
I
one.
haven't even told one yet.
I know you haven't finished, has he? Well,
He ought to finish the one he started.
Yes.
I mean, he started, let him continue, and
Yeah.
see what happens.
Like you need to switch off at the wall as well. Start the whole thing again.
Well, we're obviously not hearing
Why are
very
you
much.
listening to that, Greg? Log off.
We're hearing Valerie, I think.
Yeah. Yes, we're
Somewhere.
hearing Valerie.
Yeah. but he's now switched it off. So, right,
yeah, he's
Ray,
probably
off
going
you
to
go.
do what
you
you
know.
suggested, Christopher.
Yeah. Right. There was.
I will now tell you that joke which I was starting to tell. Anyway, it seems to a chap, as you know, the Jewish chap lying down the street. Nobody knew he was Jewish, so they got a priest to come and speak to him. And the priest leant down and said, "Do you believe in the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost?" And the Jewish chap looked up and said, "I'm dying, and he asked me riddles." Yeah, I like that. I thought, yeah, it's amusing. It's not dirty. So there you go. As I say, another Jewish chap who's lying in the street, and so a nurse bends down to him and says, "You know, are you comfortable, Mr. Cohen?" And he looks up and says, "I've got 2 shops and a laundrette."
Oh dear.
And yes, and anyway, life gets is amusing, you know. And I hear, as people know, I like the silly and the sometimes crazy jokes. They ask me, they tell me things like this, you know. And this one, as Graham is not here yet, is that my last one of the day. Now, this is a true story. Really, folks, it's a true story. There was a friend of mine who got a job as an infant school teacher in a school in Liverpool. And she said, because this very small children have little accidents, they have little bits of underwear which they keep in the class for this purpose. And she said one day it happened to a little girl. So the next morning, she was in the classroom settling all the children down, and the parents were there and all this type of thing. And the little girl appeared at the doorway of the school, the class, and yelled across the classroom, "Here, miss, Dad's got your pants in his pocket." Which I thought, yeah, that's very classic small child. And she said she didn't know quite what to say. They're not mine, or something like that. But there you are. No, I was most amused by that. You know, I nearly dropped the pint of beer which I was holding at the time. Hopefully, we should have the Graham returned as if by magic soon.
Could I perhaps share, though you probably know already, that Central Meeting are welcoming the Young Christian Climate Network pilgrims tomorrow morning at 9:30. We're actually almost certainly going to be meeting in St. Matthias Park because of the construction work at the meeting house. And it will include 20 minutes meeting for worship. We'll go on the whole event till 10:30. So all friends are welcome.
A worthy cause.
Yes, I should have mentioned it's on its way to COP26, but that may be obvious.
That's tomorrow, is it, Chris?
Well, yes, Saturday morning, 9:30 to 10:30. They're going on to Keynsham.
Right. See a couple of people have lots of plants in their picture. I have a plant nearby me here, which is on the window, and it is slowly dying, sad thing. But, you know, water it and speak to it and, you know, and give it fertilizer and things like that. And the blasted thing's still dying, you know. You kind of think, you know, what am I doing to these plants? You know, negative energy or something, you know, but there you go. You know, I think I think I need to repot it because it seems to be trying to climb out of its pot type of thing, poor thing, you know, but there you are. I do that to plants, except for cacti. I'm very good at cacti. But they're not in the window, you know. So I'm told by the plants people that they don't like direct sun. So cacti.
Can it be that cacti don't like direct sun? Cacti live in the desert. That seems a bit crazy to me.
A cacti.
Well,
Look at that. Isn't that lovely?
you're doing the right thing. It's beautiful.
Yes.
Good. Or as it says on this pot, it's a succulent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
While we're waiting, could I introduce a serious note, please?
Could you do what?
Can I introduce us? Oh, Graham's connected, so I won't.
Let's see how well connected he is.
Speak to us, Graham.
Turn up the volume.
Still connecting.
Topic is obviously too controversial.
Right, I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
Yes.
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 Yes. Yeah.
I had to switch computers because my laptop had launched into reconfiguring Windows, which was obviously going to take about half an hour. But anyway, I'm now with you, and I'm very sorry about this delay.
Well, at least we managed to get you on audio, which is good. So, without further ado, and other things, I will now introduce Graham Davey, who is going to speak to us today. His title is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Mahatma Gandhi and Pacifism. So,
Thank you very much, Ray.
Whenever you're ready.
I'm going to give an outline of the life of Gandhi and Bonhoeffer, and then make some distinctions and comparisons between them. The purpose really of this talk is to present you with a challenge of what we as Quakers would do had we find ourselves in a situation similar to these two great men, both of whom were confronted by repressive regimes, practicing enormous cruelty and struggling with the idea of whether they were justified in associating themselves with violence in order to counter it. On the assumption that you probably know more about Gandhi than you do about Bonhoeffer, I'm going to start with a life of Gandhi, born 1869 in Gujarat, in the top northwest corner of India, well-off family. His mother was a devout Hindu, but with strong Jain influence, which meant that from Gandhi's early childhood, there was an atmosphere in the home that it was wrong to harm, let alone kill, any living creature. So the basis of pacifism was already there. He had a very undistinguished performance at school. He was not brilliant by any means, and managed to get permission to study law in London, which he did at the end of the 1880s. And he was successful there. He learned English, of course, and passed his law exams. He had promised his mother that he would not eat meat, and this forced him to find out about the London Vegetarian Society. And through that, he met a number of English intellectuals, including Edwin Arnold, who had fairly recently translated the Bhagavad Gita into English, this essence of Hindu teaching. So Gandhi read that as a Hindu for the first time in English. I don't know what he gained from that. He certainly didn't gain pacifism. The whole of the Gita is based on instructions to the warrior Arjuna that he has to take part in a battle which would involve him fighting against the side which includes his own relatives. So it was just very much a message of doing one's duty, doing what one was called to do, and that requiring very often strong self-discipline against other inclinations. At the same time, Gandhi was introduced to the New Testament and was naturally very much impressed with the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus's teaching about loving one's enemy, turning the other cheek, and so on. When he had qualified and gone back to India, he tried to practice as a lawyer and was quite useless. He was tongue-tied and no good at all. And in the end, after trying a number of different jobs not connected with law, he accepted an engagement with an Indian businessman in South Africa and went to South Africa to represent this man in 1893. That legal case was settled with a compromise, but while in South Africa, Gandhi was increasingly engaged in leading local Asians in opposition to the discrimination and oppression which they suffered under both Boer and British authorities. Things like forced registration, fingerprinting, a ban on movement between the Transvaal and Natal, Asian marriages not being recognized unless they were Christian. And there were routine humiliations. They had to give way, had to step off a footpath to give way to anybody with white skin. One incident with Gandhi which made a deep impression of him was his refusal to leave a first-class compartment on a train, although he had a first-class ticket. And in the end, he was physically thrown off the train onto the platform at Pietermaritzburg and spent the night in the open there thinking about how he was going to join with those who were countering this kind of routine oppression. He read voraciously while he was in South Africa, something like 80 books a day, and was particularly influenced by John Ruskin, by Henry David Thoreau, by Leo Tolstoy, and to some extent by Rabindranath Tagore, noting that these influences came from different continents. Ruskin was English, Thoreau was American, Tolstoy was Russian, and Tagore was Indian. all of these consolidated his beliefs in social justice and non-violence, ahimsa, the rejection of violence in achieving justice. Gandhi didn't use the word pacifism, possibly because of its misunderstanding, right, being associated with passivity. But he had and developed a philosophy which he expressed as satyagraha. And this was explained to me in India as seeking out, grasping, holding on to truth. Judith Brown, an Oxford academic, describes it as follows. For Gandhi, non-violence was embedded in a theological vision of reality and of man. It was at its deepest level a religious commitment, a matter of faith, not a freestanding strategy or option which could be taken up or put down at will, depending on the circumstances. And for Gandhi, truth, the word truth, was almost synonymous with God. So although the word satyagrahi came to be used for any non-violent social activist, its real meaning for Gandhi was something much deeper than that, and very, very much with a religious foundation. The actions which Gandhi helped to organize in South Africa were things like the burning of registration certificates, mass strikes, marches, and these activities resulted in many being injured, some were killed, thousands were imprisoned, including Gandhi. But Gandhi, through his writing, succeeded in gaining considerable international publicity. To promote the kind of discipline which would enable activists to take part in these actions without resorting to violence, he set up 2 ashrams in South Africa, one called Phoenix Farm, and then the second one was Tolstoy Farm. And life in these ashrams was pretty tough. In fact, some of those who were returning to the ashram from prison said they were tempted to stay in prison because life was rather easier there. They were better looked after than they were under Gandhi's regime in the ashram. Well, eventually Gandhi left South Africa in 1915 at the age of 45. So he didn't start in India until what at that time was quite late middle age. And after a year spent touring the country, listening to people and their problems, he helped to organize the same kind of actions in India that he had in South Africa. There were strikes, there's non-payment of taxes, marches, the boycott of imported cloth, and he set up 2 more ashrams, one at Sabarmati near Ahmedabad in the north of India, and one at Sevagram later on in near Nagpur in central India. 2 kinds of issues that he was attempting to deal with. One were local political or economic issues, and these were practiced in Kera district, Bardoli. There were the indigo farmers in Bihar. All of them preceded by attempts to negotiate a settlement. And then when that was unsuccessful, then the people responded under Gandhi's leadership with actions against the authorities, other local authorities. The other kind of movements which Gandhi initiated and supported were all India movements. There was a non-cooperation movement which followed the Amritsar massacre of 1919, when nearly 400 people were massacred by machine guns. They were trapped in a courtyard, and some were killed directly, others threw themselves into a well to escape the bullets and drowned. Incidentally, a massacre carried out by Indian troops under the orders of British officers, the one in charge, Dyer, when he returned to the United Kingdom, received with praise and acclamation for his efforts to maintain British sovereignty in India. So they were different times. Then there was the salt tax, a nationwide protest initiated by the Salt March in 1930, and opposition to participation in World War II, 1940-41. The local actions came nearer to success. If there was a specific issue, a disciplined, peaceful protest against a local authority with the power to change the situation, then more often than not, a settlement was reached which was satisfactory. The All India campaigns were less successful. They gained more publicity, and the United Kingdom suffered some embarrassment internationally due to publicity given to the numbers put in prison. Some of you may remember the scene in the film Gandhi by Richard Attenborough of a large crowd attempting to break into the Dharasana salt works. And as each file comes up to the doors, they're beaten back and injured, their bodies are dragged away, and the next file comes up and is beaten in the same way. And that was witnessed by an American journalist who publicized it, and it didn't do the British reputation any good. But these All India campaigns were impossible to control. The issue, whatever it was interpreted in different ways by local groups. That was one problem. And secondly, there was always the danger that they would resort to violence, usually protesters against the police or government forces, or it might be landlords against the tenants, or religious or caste groups against each other. So if you have the idea that Gandhian non-violence brought about the independence of India, really that's not true. When independence came in 1947, it was much more to do with the decline of British interests in India, the impact of the Second World War, and the pressure of public opinion, both within the country and in the Western world, most notably the United States. Did Gandhi reject violence in all circumstances? No, he didn't. He was not a sort of absolutist pacifist. He wrote, "I do believe that where there is only a choice between cowardice and violence, I would advise violence. I would rather have India resort to arms in order to defend her honor than that she should, in a cowardly manner, become or remain a helpless witness to her own dishonor." And so as a result, as the Japanese were invading Burma and putting India under considerable threat of invasion, Gandhi helped to recruit to the Indian army in order to strengthen the resistance to the Japanese. The last months of his life were marked by desperate efforts to quell Hindu-Muslim conflict at the time of partition of India into the country of India and Pakistan. He recognized that he had to work closely with the Muslims in order to do this, and was remarkably successful in preventing conflict in Calcutta and to some extent in Bihar as well. But it was that close association with Muslims which caused his death. He was assassinated by a Hindu extremist in January 1948. So that's the life of Gandhi. Not quite a pacifist, but certainly a man whose ideas developed in that direction and who practiced what he preached pretty effectively. Although at the end of his life, he felt himself to be a failure. Moving on to Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who at first sight is totally different. In the 1950s, there were several publishers who were publishing cheap paperbacks on modern theological matters. And one of them was Fontana, who in 1959 produced Bonhoeffer's Letters and Papers from Prison in English at a cost of 2 6d, 12.5 pence today. A very good value for money, and a well-worn edition is on our bookshelves here at home. And the interest in Bonhoeffer, which that started, was then heightened by his featuring in the book Honest to God by John Robinson in 1963. Valerie and I used an extract from a wedding sermon in Letters and Papers at our own wedding. So we were pretty well aware of Bonhoeffer's contribution. He was born in 1906. He and his twin sister were number 6 and 7 of 8 children. But the family could well afford to bring up 8 children. They were well-to-do in Berlin. Father was a professor of neurology at Berlin University, and mother was very talented as well. And unlike Gandhi, Bonhoeffer was also a brilliant student and an exceptionally gifted pianist. Could have done anything, but to his parents' surprise, he chose to study theology at Tübingen University. There was no hint of pacifism in his thinking. Bonhoeffer and his family shared with most other Germans of their class their complete resentment at the terms of the Versailles Treaty. And Bonhoeffer believed it would be quite natural and honorable to take up arms in defense of his country. Indeed, while at Tübingen University studying theology, he joined a student cadet corps and went on a 2-week course that included secret military training in contravention of the terms of the Versailles Treaty. Nevertheless, during the winter of 1924-25, he talked with a fellow theology student about Gandhi's personality and work. So there was the beginning of interest there. Bonhoeffer returned to study at the University of Berlin, and then in 1928 he spent a year as an assistant pastor to the German congregation in Barcelona, Spain. Late in the 1920s, the National Socialists gained influence. They became the Nazis, of course, and persecution of Jews and other minority groups increased. This was largely accepted by the educated German population, partly because they had an even greater fear of a communist revolution. And secondly, they saw that persecution as a necessary condition for achieving the supreme aim of making Germany great again. 1930-31, Bonhoeffer spent a year studying at the Union Theological Seminary in New York, and he learned about poverty in a rich country. Working with a black student, he learned about racial abuse based simply on the color of his fellow student's skin. But most important of all, he was influenced by a French student, Jean Lasserre, who opened his mind to the possibility that the Sermon on the Mount might actually be taken literally. He had previously regarded it, and Jesus' teaching about loving one's enemies, as an impossible ideal, which could not possibly be put into practice. But that was the beginning of his respect for the possibility of achieving what he wanted without resorting to violence. After that year, Bonhoeffer returned to Berlin as a lecturer and pastor, but he developed ecumenical and international links through his appointment as Youth Secretary of the World Alliance for Promoting International Friendship through the churches. And this took him to meet different Europe with Reverend Charlie Andrews, who was a close friend of Gandhi. So we learned more about Gandhi then. 1933-34, he was pastor of the 2 German congregations in London. And during this time, he read Gandhi's autobiography, and he heard a talk by Madeline Slade, English woman who, under the name of Miraben, became a close associate of Gandhi in India. So that again heightened his interest. And in 1934, he wrote to Gandhi asking if he could stay at Sevagram for 6 months in the winter of 1935-36. And Gandhi replied, yes, he'd have to pay his own travel, but provided Gandhi was not in prison, then Bonhoeffer would be welcome. In fact, Bonhoeffer didn't go to India, so he and Gandhi never met. In Germany, the majority of German churchmen, led by Lutheran bishops, pledged loyalty to the Führer. But Bonhoeffer and his family saw through the aims of the Nazis and were totally opposed to Hitler. A minority group of Christian leaders met at Barmen in the Ruhr and declared their allegiance to Jesus Christ as the only source of God's revelation. This became known as the Barmen Declaration, and it led to the foundation of what was called the Confessing Church, and Bonhoeffer was a leading member of that. For the Confessing Church to survive, it had to have a supply of sympathetic pastors who also rejected the required oath of loyalty to the Führer. And in 1935, Bonhoeffer was asked to direct a seminary for training pastors for the Confessing Church. And this, therefore, took priority over working with Gandhi in India. Bonhoeffer visited various seminaries and training establishments for ordinands in the United Kingdom, including Woodbrook. Don't know quite what he learned from Woodbrook, and then set up his own seminary, which was at a place called Finkenwalde on the Baltic coast. It was closed down by the Gestapo in July 1937, but the training of pastors continued secretly until March 1940. Bonhoeffer became associated with a number of civilians and top military officers who opposed the Nazis. His sister, older sister Christel, had married Hans von Dochnany. Now, Hans von Dochnany was the son of the Hungarian composer Ernst von Dochnany and the father of Christoph von Dochnany, who is still alive at about the age of 90 and still well known as an international conductor. Now, Hans, that's Christoph's father, was a lawyer in the ironically called Ministry of Justice under the Nazis, and therefore, because of the German efficiency in recording everything that happened, he knew of details of the oppression of the Jews and other minority groups and the appalling atrocities which were taking place in Poland following the invasion in September 1939. Now, these various people who were trying to think of ways in which the Nazi regime could be overcome planned initially to try to arrest Hitler and replace the regime with a non-Nazi government. But then the military successes in 1940, the invasion of France and the capitulation of the French government in 4 days made that impossible. So there was no support within the army, which would have been necessary, of course, had it been possible to arrest Hitler and put him on trial. So Bonhoeffer wrestled with the issue of whether a Christian could use violence to achieve a desirable end. And he expressed this in his study of the Sermon on the Mount, called The Cost of Discipleship. He came to the conclusion that there was no alternative. So he continued his association with the conspirators who were now planning Hitler's assassination. His immediate need was to avoid conscription. He felt he could not apply to be a conscientious objector, although that was possible, as this would have been seen as confirming the non-patriotic stance of the confessing church, of which he was a leading member. And the answer came through Hans von Dochnany getting Bonhoeffer invited to join the Abwehr, the German military intelligence organization, which was in fact, unknown to Hitler, a hotbed of conspirators who were trying to assassinate him. And Bonhoeffer was recruited to this Abwehr officially to gather information through his international links, which would be useful for the German war effort. Now, in fact, of course, Bonhoeffer used his international links in order to spread news of the plans of the conspirators and to promote support for a post-Nazi government if it could be formed. But then in April 1943, he was arrested by the Gestapo in connection with the provision of a large sum of money which was used to smuggle Jewish refugees to Switzerland. The Gestapo suspected, rightly, that they were not Abwehr agents, but people trying to escape. And so from then to the end of his life, Bonhoeffer was in prison. While in prison, he wrote letters to a former student and pastor who was now serving in the German army. And the letters were smuggled out, in addition to other letters which Bonhoeffer was allowed to write to his family. These were smuggled out and of course kept throughout the rest of the war. And in them, Bonhoeffer began to express his radical ideas on theology and the role of the church. In July 1944, the bomb plot against Hitler failed. Hitler was injured but survived. This was the last of about 40 attempts to assassinate Hitler. And 2 months later, incriminating files were found associating Bonhoeffer with the conspirators. Hitler decided just before his own suicide that none of those connected with the conspiracy against him would survive. So Bonhoeffer and Hans von Dohnanyi and Klaus Bonhoeffer, Dietrich, his brother, were all executed. Bonhoeffer hanged in April 1945, 4 weeks before the Germans surrendered. Looking at these two men, very different, of course, in culture and religion. East and West are different, and one came from the East, one came from the West. Their exposure to pacifist ideas was different in the early stages. Different academic achievements. Gandhi was very ordinary at first, and Bonhoeffer brilliant, although Gandhi, of course, mastered English and passed his law exams. He wasn't intellectually backward. They had very different circumstances in which to operate. Gandhi had basic support from most of the population who were opposed to the Raj, the British rule of India. Bonhoeffer was always one of a small minority in Germany. Yet in other ways, the two men were similar. Both of them had a significant contribution to their education in the English language. Gandhi in studying law in London, and Bonhoeffer at the Union Theological Seminary in New York, plus his 2 years in London. The whole of his life was education. Both were strongly influenced by the Sermon on the Mount, and both recognized the need for action to challenge and stop oppression while rejecting the use of violence. They both accepted the inevitability of suffering, and both were killed in the end by members of their own culture and their own religion. Neither of them was 100% pacifist. Both accepted the need for a violent response in exceptional circumstances. They both made great sacrifices. While Gandhi was in South Africa, he set up a law firm in Johannesburg, and at one time was earning up to £5,000 a year, an enormous sum of money at the beginning of the 20th century. But he gave all that up and resorted to life in the ashram, wearing Indian dress. Bonhoeffer, as an academic, could have earned much more and had a much more comfortable life had he not chosen the path of being a pastor and a church leader. And they both showed great courage. Gandhi was seriously beaten up while he was in South Africa, and he faced continuous danger in India. In fact, in January 1948, a bomb exploded at a prayer meeting early in that month. And it was only, and Gandhi's practice, his openness continued, although he was aware that people were trying to kill him. And then he was shot by this Hindu extremist on January the 30th. Bonhoeffer also made big sacrifice. His friends had arranged for him to take up a lectureship at the Union Theological Seminary in New York in 1939. And in fact, Bonhoeffer went to New York, but in spending 3 weeks there, he realized he'd made a big mistake, that he had to go back to Germany. He said it would not be possible for him to help the restoration of the German church after the war if he had not shared in the suffering of Germans during the war. And so we went back to Germany from New York in August 1939 on the last passenger ship to cross in that direction. So both differences and similarities between two great men, and both of them are venerated by statues in central London. There's a statue of Gandhi in Parliament Square, and a few yards away, rather less accessible, there's a statue of Bonhoeffer as one of 10 20th century martyrs on the west front of Westminster Abbey. So they are remembered. I return to the challenge I presented you at the beginning. Had I been as a Quaker in that situation, particularly Germany in the 1930s, what would I have done?
Well done.
I would suggest that as for technical reasons we started late, it's now coming up to 12, but if those who want to stay and talk with Graham, we'll extend the meeting till 12:15. Does that seem reasonable? But obviously anybody who's got to go, you know, just leave the meeting and do that. But anybody willing to? Oh, Graham's got something to say again.
I feel I ought to answer my own question, and at this stage of my life, I have to admit, I keep my head down and keep out of trouble. When I was younger, perhaps, but not now. Too old.
Can I just thank you all? It's been very good, and thank you, Graham. But I'm very sorry, I will have to leave. But thank you for your remark about your own feelings about now. So thank you for now. Thank you.
There has been in the past a number of Black Americans and some Black Africans who have been saying, you know, liberation by any cause is preferable than the state that they find themselves now in. Is this what we are coming to see, or can you see on the horizon at least any group or person who would campaign in the way of pacifism and Quakers?
A true non-violent resistance, that's in my limited experience, not being tried. Perhaps Hong Kong is an example of where they've tried hardest, but I jotted down a list of 9 countries where there is a repressive regime and resistance to it from the population. And non-violent protests that Gandhi helped to organize. It's extremely difficult, of course, without Gandhi's charisma to persuade people in large numbers that this is a valid way of responding, that violence breeds more violence, that the forces you are opposing, being the government and control of the army and the police and all their associated weaponry, you haven't got a chance of defeating them by violent means. But for Gandhi, it wasn't just taking part in a march or a vigil. It was the publicity associated with it as well. And had he had the opportunity of improved communications, forget about the problems this morning, and the use of social media and so on, the kind of pictures which would have gone around the world would have seriously embarrassed the regime that was trying to use fraud, corruption to stay in power. I've always regretted, particularly in the Palestinian struggle against the government of Israel. Do they have to fire rockets from Gaza into Israel? What good does that do? It just sort of heightens the resolve of the Israeli government to work towards an exclusively Jewish state. And that's sad. I just wish that in one of these struggles, something much closer to Gandhian techniques could be tried out.
Can I go next? Yes, I think one of the things that I think is good at present is not actually individuals, but the mainly peaceful demonstrations we've had in Bristol in recent times. You know, it's been encouraging the large number of people who have wanted to take part in them and have taken part in them. But as for myself, when I joined Friends, I did say I had hesitations about the peace testimony as far as my personal reactions go. And I think 40 years later, it may be the same, but then I know I haven't, it's not something I've worked on at all. But I do admire people like David Mowat who have got the training in, you know, non-violent negotiation with people. Whereas me, I still know that my temper would probably get the better of me very quickly. Would I be brave? Possibly, because I can be very stubborn. Yes, don't hold your breath, as they say. Right.
David?
Oh, right. Fine.
Yes, I was going to say something in the same kind of direction as Christopher, and that is that the, you know, in the last couple of years, the arising of Extinction Rebellion, not against state violence, but against state inaction, has been quite a phenomenon. and very deliberately chose to use non-violent approaches. And it offers trainings in non-violence, and you're welcome as a member of Extinction Rebellion if you adhere to certain principles. And Extinction Rebellion groups can act quite autonomously as long as they adhere to these principles, which include non-violence. There are 10 core principles which seem to borrow quite a lot from Quakers, actually. And so it's not so much a response to state violence, but state inaction in the face of a crisis which members of Extinction Rebellion and scientists and others consider to be existential for humanity. So it's, the principles of non-violence have been very consciously adopted, and Extinction Rebellion has, when things have got a little bit fruity, that has caused introspection and deep discussion in XR about sticking to our principles.
I'm sorry, Christopher, did I cut you off then? I didn't mean to. Maybe not. Then.
Which Christopher are you talking to?
You.
All right, no, I was just going to, choose the next speaker, but I think Chris and Angela want to speak. But you're the chair. I will sit back and just listen.
Angela.
Well, I think one of the French sayings that seems to me to be so profound is plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more they say the same. Although I think there's glimmer of hopes when brave young footballers take the knee, and that requires courage, because there is a violence that was certainly, I think, on the part of our present Prime Minister and the present Home Secretary. There is a violence of how you speak and what you do. And I think perhaps, as an 82-year-old, I'm always, I hope, prepared to speak up, but it would probably be, I will speak up on the bus if someone is, if someone does something vile to someone else, I will speak up. I'm just thinking of, I have an American friend that I lived with my first husband in America. We were in New York when Kennedy was assassinated, so a long time ago. But she always sends a Christmas card, and it says, "Let there be peace and let it start with me." And I think starting with peace, and it's not easy, is maybe what I try to do.
Yes.
Yes, not a lot of time, but at first I became a Christian pacifist as a result, yes, of reading the Sermon on the Mount, learning about, as it happens, both Gandhi, less Bonhoeffer. Actually worked for the Fellowship of Reconciliation. And I have not faced a repressive regime as violent as the Nazi. I have cut down 2 panels of fence at the atomic weapons establishment, Aldermaston. I've blocked the road in through atomic weapons establishment, Burfield. I blocked the gate of Plaistow police station to stop the illegal deportation of a man facing actually religious persecution back in Nigeria and separation from his family. These mostly were in the past. I recognize the dilemma being of relatively advanced years, that being locked on is a problem if you can't stay in one place for very long. but I still think it's valid and necessary. We don't face the same challenge as the Germans did in the 30s, but we are facing the prospect of ordinary demonstrations which should not have been 100% agreed by the police and are causing some annoyance or disruption of people's lives, i.e. because they're on a road and it blocks the traffic or something like that, actually being made illegal. That's the implication of the police bill. So we seem to be being pushed into almost a situation where we have to take non-violent direct action, which involves the risk of arrest, simply in order to get the issues that we care most about, whether it's opposition to the deployment of weapons, whether it's rising racism, whether it's failure to act on the climate and ecological emergency. The other point I wanted to make, limited time, is that the Arab Spring was initially non-violent and influenced by non-violent guidance, particularly Gene Sharp. Sadly, the non-violent stream wasn't strong enough, and it fairly quickly shifted to violence, of which the most extreme example is what happened in Syria. That's more an illustration of how, if in desperation because of anger, you do resort to violence, then you end up with a situation like in Syria, and also to a lesser degree in Egypt, where there's now you exchange one military dictator with another. Yes, and finally, I do think, and I'm very glad that XR does non-violence training, and happily also that our friend David Moat is introducing non-violence training and action specifically in relation to opposition to the police bill. And I do advise you to get online and read it. It is a very regressive bit of legislation. So, yes, the need for Quaker reconciliation and non-violence is as much as it ever was. I should say that one other bit is that I came to Quakers partly because of peace testimony.
Well, before we go our own separate ways, have you any final comments, observations, or anything like that, Graham?
Oh dear, I think
it's gone silent again.
Yes.
I fear you. I fear you've gone silent on us again, Graham. Sadly. No. No. Go on again. Okay, friends. I think, sadly, no. Sadly, Graham has gone silent on us again. So maybe that's a.
You hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
unplugged the headset, and I must be now using the computer microphone. Well, I said thank you very much for turning up and showing some interest, and thank you for your helpful, interesting comments. And there's no shortage of literature, of course, about both Gandhi and Bonhoeffer, if you want to study their lives in any more detail, but you've probably had enough. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Graham.
Yeah, thank you, friends, and go well.